And so I thought, what about now? I stopped going to front lines, but then I went to the ultimate front line, which is my own death, my own mortality, this thing we all face and that almost all of us fear. I was allowed to go to the precipice, look over the edge, and then allowed to come back. Did I come back with any sacred knowledge? In other words, any knowledge that will help me or other people live with more dignity, less fear, more connection, more love, et cetera, et cetera. That's the task.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Drive Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Attia. Sebastian, thanks so much for coming to Austin. It's great to finally meet you in person, having spoken with you and emailed you many times over the past few years, and spoken with you obviously on a previous podcast. This book is really a fantastic book. It's hard to describe the experience of reading it. It's I think it's so beautiful. It can almost bring you to tears in certain sections because there are the stories within it that sort of tell us about our mortality. But I also think there's something so beautiful about it, which I'm curious if others have explained to you their reaction, which is you can feel so incredibly insignificant reading this, which is actually kind of a nice thing. It makes this whole thing seem a little less scary. And by this whole thing, I mean death.
Well, our insignificance in the cosmos does sort of take the pressure off, right? Like, we don't mean anything, and that's terrifying and kind of liberating. I mean, it's sort of both. And one of the things I talk about in the book is a kind of reverence for life, and I think it's quite hard to find one's way in the busyness of daily life in our modern society. It's quite hard to find your way to that reverence. It was for me, without having been terrified. Once I was terrified by almost dying, the flip side of that terror was reverence, and I found it quite easily after that. And so for me, at one point after my near-death experience, I had a lot of psychological struggles. We can talk about that, but at one point, my wife said to me, "Sebastian, do you feel lucky or unlucky that you almost died? I mean, not that you survived, of course you're lucky, but that it happened at all.
Yeah.
Like, if you could go back and push a button and have it not happen, would you push that button?" And I didn't, I honestly didn't know how to answer. Was I blessed or cursed? And the psychological consequences of almost dying and what I saw on the threshold, what I remember from the threshold, they were frankly so devastating that I absolutely felt cursed. And then in struggling to answer, I tracked down the origin of the word blessing. Now, I'm an atheist, but I feel that there are secular meanings to words, beautiful words like blessing or sacred, that we atheists are free to use. So I tracked down the origin of the word blessing, and it comes from the Anglo-Saxon bletzian, which means blood. And the idea being that there is no blessing without a wounding, without a sacrifice. And maybe there's no wounding without a blessing. And that battlefields are sacred because blood has been shed. Childbirth is sacred because blood has been shed. In pre-Christian Europe, often animals were sacrificed on holy days to bless fields, to bless buildings, to bless people. And so that the twinning of blessing and wounding that really they're the same. They're aspects of the same thing. And when I realized that, it allowed me to make this sort of psychological step, an important psychological step, where I stopped feeling sort of cursed by too much knowledge, that I'd somehow gotten too much knowledge on the threshold of death and couldn't continue daily life with that knowledge. It was too burdensome. It was too scary. It was too true. And once I read the origin of the word blessing, I was like, oh, I'm free. It's both. How wonderful. And that really did sort of release me from this existential conundrum that I was in.
I think it's probably worth telling listeners, if they haven't already read the book or even heard you on another podcast where you've described the story of what happened in June of 2020. In fact, you and I actually discussed it a little bit, I believe, on our last podcast. But again, maybe just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about vis-a-vis your experience. Do you want to kind of recount the story in enough detail that people will understand the technical aspects of what happened and basically how much luck played a role in you sitting here today?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So last night at my book reading at Book People in Austin, yesterday was June 16. And I was able to, because of the time difference, et cetera, with the East Coast, I was able to say to the audience, this moment, right now, this moment, exactly 4 years ago, I started dying. It was exactly the time. And so it was during COVID. I was living with my family at the time, a 3-year-old girl and a 6-month-old girl, my little daughters, and my wife, Barbara. We were living in an old house in a remote part of Massachusetts at the end of a dead-end dirt road, deep in the woods, no cell phone service, landlines that would short out when it rained and often didn't work. And in other words, paradise, right? And we were there during COVID, and I was in my 50s, a lifelong athlete, in extremely good health, strong, like never thought twice about emergency transport to a hospital. Why would I? I'm not a walking heart attack. I don't have high cholesterol, et cetera, et cetera. I know we all age and we can get cancer and things like that, but the idea, I didn't think I had anything that would drop a middle-aged man in his tracks, right? And who knew? So one afternoon, some neighbors down the road called the family that we knew, and the teenage girls offered to come over and babysit. And that was a rare opportunity. So we jumped on it. The girls came over to babysit our little girls, and my wife and I went off to a cabin that's even deeper in the woods and an even more beautiful spot, and completely cut off from everything and down a trail. And we were able to spend a couple of hours there, and thank God we did, and that I didn't go running or something that would have put me even more off the grid, because I would have died had that happened. We were in this cabin, and in mid-sentence, I felt this sort of stab of pain in my abdomen. It wasn't unbearable, but it really got my attention, and it wouldn't go away. Unlike indigestion, some digestive pain, it just nothing would ease it. And I finally stood up to sort of walk it out, and the floor went reeling away from me, and I almost fell over, and I sat back down, and I said words I never thought I'd have to say. I said, honey, I think I'm going to need help. I've never felt anything like this. And she sort of half dragged me out of the cabin and down the trail, and we made it to the dirt driveway, and she put me in the passenger seat of the car and ran in to tell the babysitters, try to call the ambulance. Something's wrong with Sebastian. And I, I'm sitting there in the car, and now I start going blind. The sky turns electric white, and the electric white takes over the trees and the house and everything around me, and I didn't know it, but I was in and out of consciousness, and these were all the symptoms of catastrophic blood loss. So what had happened was I'd had an aneurysm, an unnatural ballooning at one spot in my pancreatic artery, which is this little artery that almost no one ever needs to think about, and I had an aneurysm in this thing, which is really quite rare, and it was the result of having a ligament sort of in the wrong place in my abdomen that sort of occluded my celiac artery. It's all sort of rather complicated, but basically the celiac is this garden hose, and if you cut it off with this ligament in the wrong place, the blood has to flow somewhere else, and it flows through these smaller arteries, and if one of them has a weak spot or a vulnerability, that weak spot will balloon, and the bubble will get bigger and bigger, and the arterial wall will get thinner and thinner, and it can rupture. And if it ruptures, you're now bleeding out into your own body, into your own abdomen. If someone had done you the favor of stabbing you in the stomach, when they got you to the hospital, the doctors would know where to put their finger to stop the bleed, right? In some ways, it's an easier proposition, but with internal hemorrhage, it can be quite hard to find the location. I mean, to the layman, your abdomen is just a big bowl of spaghetti. Like, where do you even start looking, and how do you get in there? And So I didn't know all of this, but I had an undiagnosed aneurysm that had been growing probably for decades, and it had finally ruptured in that moment. And I was losing a pint of blood probably every 10 or 15 minutes into my abdomen. And there's 10 units of blood in the human body, thereabouts. And you can lose maybe 2/3 of it before you sort of cross over to territory where it's really hard to come back from, even if you're transfused. And we lived a 1-hour drive from the nearest hospital. So I was literally a human hourglass. And the ambulance finally came, and off we went. And I had sort of rebooted a bit. I went into compensatory shock, which makes you feel a little bit better for a little while. And an hour later, we pulled into the hospital. And I went out of compensatory shock right then into end-stage hemorrhagic shock, deeply hypothermic, not of right mind, and actively dying, and would probably have been dead in the next 10 or 15 minutes had I not been in an ER at that moment, and they rushed me into the trauma bay and started trying to save my life.
Yeah, I'll share an interesting anecdote from my days in the trauma center at Johns Hopkins, which is that time to hospital, and more specifically, time to either surgery or IR, interventional radiology, which is where your life was saved, is the single most important metric. And there's an amazing guy named Eddie Cornwall, who was at the time the chief of trauma surgery at Hopkins, who wanted to test this because of an interesting observation he had made, which was when he was a trauma surgeon in Los Angeles, he noticed that the gangbangers who were brought in by their buddies were surviving at a slightly higher rate than those that were brought in by ambulance. Wow. This is very counterintuitive, right? So this is all penetrating trauma. It's what we called the knife and gun club. And when a guy got shot or stabbed and his buddies drove him to the ER and dropped him off and took off, because obviously everyone's in the wrong here. Right. Those guys had a better chance of surviving than the guy who got brought in by the ambulance with the IV fluids running in him and brought in. And so what Eddie and his colleagues postulated was, what could possibly be better about being thrown in the back of a truck than being in the ambulance? And he realized, well, technically those guys are getting to us sooner because no one's putting an IV in them, no one's checking their vital signs, no one's doing anything else. And so they did an experiment where, and it's kind of a crazy experiment, where depending on the day of the week, all ambulances were going to basically randomize the trauma victims to either business as usual, which means when a penetrating trauma victim is found, you do everything that you would normally do. You put the IVs in them, you stabilize them, you start running IV fluids, and you go, or what they called scoop and run, which is the ambulance would get there and wouldn't do a thing, would literally pick them up, throw them in the ambulance, and get them into the hospital. So now you had a randomized experiment, which can infer causality. And sure enough, wouldn't you know it, when you randomized to scoop and run, you did better. And so when the first thing I thought about, because nobody would believe this, and it seems so counterintuitive, had your wife been able to drive you right to the hospital, which is the most counterintuitive thing, your odds are actually higher. Now, it's fortunate that it all worked out. But again, when I was reading the story, that was my thought, was, Barbara, just take him right to the hospital now. Don't do anything. Don't call an ambulance. Don't do anything. Now, of course, the ambulance has some advantages. They have sirens. They can do all these other things. But the bottom line is your life could only be saved in an operating room or in an IR suite. Those are the only two places you were going to get saved.
Right. And you can buy a little time with a blood transfusion, but
well, you did need that as well,
right.
but you needed that as you were rolling into
exactly.
those places.
Right. And ambulances, it's changing a little bit now, but ambulances, you get IV fluid, you don't get blood.
Right.
And, you know, and the truth was, when the ambulance showed up, they came quickly, but they were probably at my place for probably 15 or 20 minutes.
Well, that's the other thing about your story that's really remarkable is how you, being probably a normal dude, was kind of like, yeah, I'm fine. I think I'm okay. I probably don't need to go in. And you almost talked them into it.
Yeah. And right. And you know, this is the famous statistic that even flashed through my mind at the time, which was married men live longer. And I watched it in action because my wife is like, you know, 10 minutes ago, he was passing out and going blind. And I don't care if he seems a little better right now. He's going downtown. Like, you're taking him right now. But they still took quite a while, and it really upset my wife.
Did they take a blood pressure on you at that moment?
Yeah. And by the time they got there, I'd gone into compensatory shock, and my blood pressure was sort of okay, I think.
Because I know that your pulse was okay, which obviously is a compensation of being fit and healthy.
Right.
But yeah, as I was reading it, of course, I'm thinking your blood pressure was probably still 80/50.
Right.
Like that would have been compensated enough for you to be not passed out.
Right.
But that's not a normal blood pressure.
Right. I don't remember it. I'm not quite sure, but but whatever it was, it didn't. It did not trigger their alarm. Yeah. And they suggested that I stay and drink some water and rehydrate in the shade, right, which would have killed me.
Yeah.
But at any rate, we got to the ER, and they rushed me into the trauma bay. The doctors knew immediately what was going on. I mean, I was pale as a sheet, and I just had blood loss written all over, internal hemorrhage written all over me. And the doctors said, so this is, of course, a semi sort of memoir type book. It's about my own experience, which as a journalist, I haven't done much of that. In fact, I've been averse to it my entire life, making myself the topic. But because I'm also a journalist, I wrote a sort of first-person account of something very intense and profound, but I interviewed everyone I could to sort of confirm to myself that what my memories are roughly correct, and to just do some reporting, because that's what one does. And so I interviewed all the doctors who would talk to me. I even interviewed my wife. I interviewed the guys who were in the back of the ambulance, or the guy who was in the back of the ambulance.
And you were able to read all of the medical records, which are very well documented, right? You timestamp every aspect of, you would have seen the moment you arrived in the ER, how many units of fluid, how many units of blood, all that stuff is communicated clearly in the record.
Yeah, and just as a writer, the language in these sort of specialty fields is so fascinating. Like, even if you don't quite understand, what's a French omniflush, whatever. Just the language is cool, right? Like, sometimes I put the language in there just because it gives you the feeling of like, wow, we're in this world, right?
Yeah.
And I've always done that in my work. But at any rate, I interviewed everyone I could afterwards, and so a couple of the doctors didn't want to talk to me. I think just because they're sort of skittish for legal reasons, even though the outcome was amazing, right? But they're still just so. So I got to they rushed me into the trauma bay, and again, these are my memories, semi-confirmed by people who were there. The doctor asked, I had no idea I was dying, like absolutely none, right?
What did you think was happening at that moment when you were sitting in the ER? Not in the ER, in the trauma bay, rather.
I sort of knew in my mind, it's not a heart attack. I don't have left side pain. I have a healthy heart. Like, there's no reason to think it was a heart attack. Maybe a stroke? Like, is that why I went blind for a while? I was sort of trying to go through the possibilities as a non-doctor.
And how much pain did you still have in your abdomen when you arrived?
I had a lot of pain.
Okay.
It wasn't kidney stone pain, right? Which is, anyone who's had kidney stones, it's all but unbearable. But it was, I'm sure I was visibly in pain, right? You could tell I'm wincing, and I'm like, I'm sure it looked like, the pain of a broken leg, something like that.
Yeah.
And so what I thought, as far as I could come to a rational thought, was, what, maybe.
Was your abdomen swelling at all?
I don't know if it was. They might have.
Nothing that you would have noticed?
No.
Okay.
No, I was, there was abdominal guarding, which I guess is the muscles tensing in the abdomen to protect an injured area. But I didn't know that. And I had the grim thought, you know what? You might have cancer or something. You might have a tumor in your abdomen that like ruptured, and I'm making this stuff up as I go along, but I was just like, maybe something like that happened, and you're going to wake up in the morning with some pretty grim news about, you got 6 months. I mean, I was sort of vaguely aware of that possibility. I had absolutely no idea that, hey man, you are dying right now.
Did an aneurysm cross your mind? Again, not a pancreas. I mean, your aneurysm is a very, very obscure one. But if you think of the two most common aneurysms in the abdomen, one would be an abdominal aortic aneurysm. Right. The other would be a splenic artery aneurysm, right, which is not that far from where yours is, although the cause is hereditary. Yours is caused by the median arcuate ligament, as you described. But, I'm sure you've heard of somebody dying from an aneurysm before. I was just curious as to what was going through.
Yeah, I have one of my best friends had an operation to replace his aorta or whatever. They had to open him up and fix his aorta because he had an aortic aneurysm. So I knew about this, but at one point a nurse rushed in because they did a CAT scan on me. I think it was a CAT scan. They pushed me through the donut very quickly, and I'm in convulsing, right? I mean, I'm in deep in shock, and I've got a heated blanket on me, and I was not doing well. But she came up to me and she said, you didn't hear it from me, but good news, it's not your aorta. And so in my civilian non-medical mind, I'm like, your aorta is part of your heart. My tummy hurts. Like what? Why are we even talking about the aorta? Like I had no idea. So no, the short answer is no. And so I just thought I might have terrible news tomorrow morning, but I had no idea that I was, it was going down right now. And I'm so glad I didn't, because I would have been absolutely terrified. And I would have been thinking about my family, my daughters, a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old. And my wife couldn't come with me.
What did you, when you went back to interview your wife, what did she think as the ambulance was leaving? What was her level of concern?
She was very, very worried, because she'd seen me go in and out of consciousness, and she just had this sense like at some point he's going to go out and not come back. She kept squeezing my hand saying, honey, stay with me, stay with me, stay with me. And I'd sort of wake up and babble and not make any sense and then go out again. So she had to watch all that, right? And and then the ER doctor called. She couldn't follow me in the ambulance because of COVID restrictions. And then the ER doctor called. It took him a while to get through to the phone because the phone lines weren't working and there was no cell phone service. It was a nightmare, right? But he finally got through. And he said, I think you should come to the hospital as fast as possible. Like, don't drive 100 miles an hour. But if this were my wife, I would be heading to the hospital fast. And she knew what that meant, right? So she arranged for care for the children and jumped in the car and drove to the hospital the whole way knowing that I might not make it. Like, why else would the doctor say that? And the doctor agreed to, told the hospital to waive the COVID restrictions so that she could come in. So she sort of knew, oh, this isn't good, right? And I later looked up the odds for surviving what I had, and they're pretty grim, right? And that's with a quick transport time. I mean, it took me an hour and a half.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable.
To get there from the onset, an hour and a half, right? And so, thank God I'm healthy. Like, I mean, if I'd had a bad heart or whatever.
Well, again, only because the actual artery that had the aneurysm is quite small.
Right.
Like, had it been, a splenic artery. Right. I mean, forget an aorta. If it was the abdominal aorta, you wouldn't have made it out of the cabin.
Right.
Right. But a slightly larger artery, and I don't think you've survived, given that you probably lost 60% of your blood volume into your abdomen. Is that, what would you?
That's what they were guessing, something like that. Yeah.
And I'm just sort of imagining how obscure this is. Like, if I were in that situation, I would be assuming this was sort of a gastric ulcer gone bad. Like, did they tell you what else they were assuming this was? Because it was pretty clear to them, I would guess, the second you arrived. Because not only do they see your vital signs, your clinical signs, at some point they've drawn blood and they've probably seen that your hemoglobin, instead of being 14, which is what it should be, or your hematocrit, in the mid 40s, was probably 10 or less at this point.
He said, the doctor said he had almost never seen hemoglobin so low. He said that's what really, I was 60, my blood pressure was 60/40, but he was like, it was the hemoglobin that really alarmed him.
Yeah.
And no, they didn't explain anything to me.
Oh, I just wonder if after the fact, they walked you through their thought process because they had a very difficult decision to make, which was to take you to the cath lab or take you to the OR. Yeah. That's a very, very big decision. You do a great job in the book of explaining the pros and cons of each. And
well,
they made the right choice.
Yeah. Well, I stabilized on hemodynamically stable, I think is the term. I stabilized on 3 units of blood.
Which is kind of amazing because that's a fraction of the blood that you lost, right? You would have probably lost 6 or 7 units.
Right.
So I guess the detail of this, I think for the listener is interesting, right? So what has to have been happening is there has to have been some tamponade.
Yes.
There has to have been, you lost 6-7 units of blood, but it must have created enough pressure around in what's called the retroperitoneum to create just enough to prevent more blood from going in, so that when they gave you those 3 units stayed in your vasculature as opposed to just continued to leak out.
Right. And the problem with going into the OR and opening you up is you lose that back pressure and your blood geysers out of there, and they have to find the bleed before you bleed out. And, it just sounds like a ghastly nightmare. Right.
Yeah. And their only option, honestly, in that situation is to do what's called cross clamp the aorta. So they actually have to take, literally, as ridiculous as that sounds, you take a big clamp and you go above the diaphragm. They might even open your chest and they put a clamp across the aorta.
Good God.
And what that does is it absolutely stops any blood flow below that point. So the good news is your heart is going to be fine, because your heart gets perfused above the aorta. Your head is fine.
Right.
Those are the 2 most important things. And what's going to happen is your kidneys are going to start dying. Everything below the body is going to have no perfusion, but that buys them enough time to find what's wrong.
And can they find it if it's not bleeding?
Well, I mean,
you know what I mean?
It's very difficult, right? Because they're going to have to go and see where the clot was, and then they're going to let the clamp off, see what comes, reclamp.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So this was something we had to do all the time in trauma and sometimes you would have to do this in the operating room, in the emergency room. Like a guy would come in and he'd have, a gunshot wound or a stab wound to his aorta. And you have to literally open his chest without anesthetizing him, because of course he's already not responsive at this point, and put your hand in, move his lungs out of the way, get all the blood out of the way, and get a clamp across the aorta.
Good God. Wow.
And I'm sure when you were, covering the wars, this is stuff that was being done in the field.
Right. It was, some of it was developed in the field apparently. So they stabilized me with 3 units over the course of an hour, and then sent me into the IR suite while they were trying to track down the interventional radiologist.
What time is it now? It's late.
Yeah, it's like 9 o'clock at night.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So they sort of called him in from sort of dinner, as it were, and from his home, Dr. Phil Dombrowski, and who was sort of known in the hospital as the magician, because he was like super, super good at his job. And so interventional radiology involves putting someone on a fluoroscope, which is like a sort of video feed X-ray machine, and inserting catheters, so rubber tubes or wire, into the venous system, usually through the right groin, into the femoral artery, and then threading it around through your body, trying to get through the twists and turns of your vasculature, trying to get it to the site that needs work, and your aorta or your pancreatic artery or whatever it may be, and that avoids having to open the person up, because you can work from the inside out, from inside the vascular system. I mean, I know you know all this, but it's fascinating. A lot of people don't. I mean, and one interventional radiologist was like, even our spouses aren't entirely sure what we do. Like, it's a rather arcane, sort of lesser known of the medical specialties, but absolutely crucial.
And then there's one other thing that they can do there, which I'm sure they explained, was they can also, when they want to, inject contrast.
They did that. That's
and then you can look for, where is it bleeding? Like, where is it leaking out of this system here?
Well, my wife finally got to the hospital, and they sort of stuck her in a basement, and there's no really waiting room because it's COVID. So she's sort of by herself in this room, and the janitor comes through once in a while to get the mop or whatever, but it's she's sort of stuck there. And at one point, after hours, a doctor sprints through, shouting into his cell phone, "It's the pancreas! It's the pancreas!" She didn't know, but he was talking about me. They'd finally located the bleed in my pancreatic artery, one of the, I think, 5 that goes into the pancreas. And so they started trying to get the catheter from my right groin in through my vasculature to the pancreatic artery, and partly because of this sort of strange anatomy that I have, the vasculature in my abdomen was very difficult to navigate. And they tried, and over the course of some hours, I just kept failing to get there.
And this is, because I listened to your book on audio, I didn't actually check. Are there figures in the actual book? Did you have an anatomic diagram of what the celiac artery looks like coming off the aorta into its pancreatic tributaries?
There's no diagrams. There's no diagrams.
I think it would be really wonderful for people listening to us now to just go on Google and go to Google Images and look up, celiac branch of the aorta or something like that, with all of its tributaries. And I think what they'll appreciate, especially if they just look at the arterial system, is you have to imagine what it's like to put a catheter in the femoral artery, which is in the groin, and then you have to snake it up the femoral artery, which is really easy. It becomes the aorta, no problem. And then you're going to pass some major branches, right? So the first thing you're going to pass on the right and left will be the renal arteries, one going to each kidney. And then there's like these little vertebral arteries and things on the way. But the really big ones you're going to see will be 2 big ones that go to the gut. They're called mesenteric arteries. But then you get to the celiac. And the problem with the celiac is, and this is not even before we're talking about yours, which is more problematic because it's compressed by the median arcuate ligament. But the problem is it's coming down. So, you describe this very well, but I think sometimes the picture says 1,000 words. Is like, how are they going to get the catheter to go up, then come down, then twist this way, then twist that way? That's the real challenge with that big 180-degree hairpin turn.
And then my vasculature around the pancreas was very contorted and distorted by the ligament in the wrong place. So I'm in the IR suite, and I'm conscious, right? I mean, they couldn't sedate me. They didn't sedate me. They gave me a little bit of fentanyl and Versed, but I'm conscious, right? And I'm I'm in enormous pain. And because all this blood has settled around my kidneys and my back, and my back was just in agony. And I think it was all the blood that was around my organs.
Are you conscious of time?
No, I was. I mean, I knew it had been. I knew it had been forever. I'll put it that way. It seemed like a very long time, but I didn't have a normal sense of, wow, it's probably been about 3 hours. I wasn't clocking it with that kind of precision, but I was in and out of some minds. I mean, I was a lot more there than I wished I'd been. And at one point, I saw the. At one point, I started seeing terrifying faces in the machinery. And in the fluoroscope that was above my head, that was really, really terrifying, and reminded me of a very scary incident in Africa that happened to me, years earlier. And but then I watched the doctors come to this moment, and I watched one of them sort of shrug his shoulders, and basically was like, "We tried, like this. This isn't going to work." And the other one sort of nodded. And I couldn't believe that I was sort of watching this. And then the first doctor, who I think was Dr. Dombrowski, said, maybe we can try one last thing, which is going through his left wrist instead of his groin. And the other doctor, Dr. Gorin, said, I like the way you think. And that somehow allowed them an approach that ultimately worked. So they went through my left wrist and through the celiac from above, and they had to get through the occlusion because the ligament is completely blocking the celiac and has been for my entire life, right? And they inflated it. They were able to push it open and pass a catheter through that, and eventually get it to to the spot and where they could embolize the rupture, they could block the rupture and pull their gear out, and they're on their way to saving my life. But I should just say, just because medicine is so extraordinary, and I'm alive because of any number of people, the team that was in the room, but decades of people inventing, doctors, researchers inventing this incredible technology, and the 10 people who donated blood that, they pumped into my veins to keep me alive. So I owe my life to many, many good people. But one of them is a German doctor named Forssmann who invented the venous catheter, right? And he did it. It's kind of a funny story. It was almost exactly 100 years ago. And he was a young guy, young doctor in a small German hospital. And he just had this idea that, like, why can't you push a catheter from a vein into your heart? Like, why can't you do that? Like,
or from an artery.
From an artery,
yeah.
right. So he asked the director of the hospital for permission to do it on a patient. And the director was like, no, we're here to heal them, not to experiment on them. Like, I think it was 1923 in Germany. So he's like, okay, well, how about a dying patient? He's like, no, we still can't do it. So he snuck into the hospital. He had a Confederate and a young nurse, and he told her that he was going to do this procedure on her, and she would be the first person to have a catheter inside her heart, which doesn't seem like, I think she was kind of sweet on him. It doesn't seem like much of an inducement, but she went for it, right? And so she lay down on the table. He had her lie down on the table, and he strapped her arm down and get ready for the procedure. And after she was strapped down, he turned away and numbed his own arm and cut his arm open and threaded a catheter into his venous system in his arm and pushed it through. And he had the tube marked off to where it would be just about in his heart. And he pushed it to the marker, and then he released her from the table. She was absolutely furious, apparently, that she'd been cheated out of being like a medical first. And they walked down to the hall to x-ray, and he told the technician to take an x-ray and prove that he was in his own heart with a catheter. So I owe my life to that guy too, right? And to the nurse in some ways who got cheated.
I remember the very first time I put a catheter into the heart as I was actually a medical student. I think today it might not be something they would let medical students do. They might want to wait for you to be a little bit more senior, but it was a little looser 25, 30 years ago. And of course it was under supervision, but to put what was called a Swan-Ganz catheter from the subclavian vein into the heart and then ultimately into the pulmonary arteries to measure the pressure of the pulmonary system. And you're sort of doing this and you can't believe that you can do this. You can't believe the human body, which on the one hand is so delicate, and you've seen what these walls of veins look like. And that's even more scary than the walls of arteries because they're so thin.
Right. And
you think, boy, if you screw this up, this person will be dead in about a minute.
Jesus.
And, then you sort of fast forward to what you experienced and the level of skill that is required. I mean, to put a balloon catheter from the subclavian vein into the pulmonary artery, believe it or not, is not that difficult. I mean, you have to absolutely know what you're doing, but right. What happened in your case is 2 orders of magnitude more skill required because they're threading something very small from your radial artery all the way up into the subclavian, into the aorta, retrograde down. And then of course they still have to do everything you just described. And again, it's, you can't use too much force, right? You can't be a brute,
right?
It's a finesse thing.
Yeah, and I was at a reading a couple of weeks ago in Atlanta, and I was talking about my book, and I was talking about the putting the we didn't. I didn't.
Oh, you put the cordis in your neck, yeah.
Right. So I was talking about putting the line into my jugular, and there was a guy in the audience who had needle phobia, and I watched him just pass out in his seat while I'm talking about this, like right in front of me, right? Eyes rolled back in his head, awful sort of strangling sounds coming out of his throat. I mean, just like I dropped him, right? And unintentionally. And so I called this for a doctor, is there a doctor in the audience, right? Like, I never thought I'd have to say that. And this older guy, two guys came rushing forward, a younger guy who was a paramedic who wrote a wonderful book called 1,000 Naked Strangers, which is a book about working on an ambulance. And then another older guy came forward and they helped this guy. He just passed out. They helped him, and he was fine, thank God. And but the older guy who came forward had trained the guy who saved my life, Dr. Dombrowski. That was his mentor.
Wow.
And he said maybe 5% of interventional radiologists could have done what Dr. Dombrowski did. He said, you're really, really lucky, like extraordinarily lucky that you really threaded the needle here medically. So they after many hours, they managed to embolize the rupture, and then I think they just knocked me out and sent me up to the ICU. I briefly remember seeing my wife and holding her hand afterwards as I was getting rolled out. And my back was still in agony, and I sort of on the way through, I begged her for a quick back rub, and the nurse was like, no back rubs. We're going to the ICU. I was just in agony, and then they knocked me out, and I woke up to the sound of nurses' voices in the ICU the next morning, and woke up completely ignorant that I'd almost died. I had no idea. And it was the ICU nurse that said, man, no one can believe you're alive. Like, you made it.
Now, was this the ICU nurse that you later spoke about?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that discussion.
So as soon as she said, Mr. Junger, congratulations, good morning, you made it, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. As soon as she said that, I was shocked, horrified and shocked. And then I had this memory from when I was on the threshold, right? It came back to me instantly. And this was the sort of, particularly for me as an atheist, this was the central mystery of my experience. And whether it's brain chemistry or not, this is the central sort of mystery that I've grappled with. So when I was in the trauma bay, the doctor said to me, can I want ask permission to put a line like through my neck into my jugular, right? Which didn't sound like a lot of fun. And I had no idea I was dying, and I didn't know what all the fuss was about. And so I said, is that really necessary? Like, why? And I said, in case there's an emergency? And he said, this is the emergency, Mr. Junger, right? And he was a young guy. He was like probably 25. I'm like, kid, I'm 3 times your age. Like, what's happening here, right? Like, and so he started working on me. And they use an ultrasound probe, and there's a whole procedure that I think probably doesn't take particularly long. It felt like a long time to me. And while I'm lying there and I'm feeling this pressure on my neck while they're starting to prep the area,
and you're under a sheet.
I'm under a
sterile sheet,
clear plastic sheet. Yeah. Right? He asks if I'm claustrophobic, and since being in combat, combat made me extremely claustrophobic for some reason that I don't understand. Apparently, that's quite common. And he said, are you claustrophobic? And I said, I am actually. And he said, well, that's too bad. And he put the sheet over me. And I was like, oh, finally someone with a sense of humor. So they're working on my neck. And to my shock, to my horror, suddenly beneath me and to my left, I sensed this black void open up, this abyss. And it's like this infinitely dark pit without dimension. And I'm getting pulled into it. And again, I have no idea that I'm dying, but I was like a wounded animal. I just had this animal sense, like, don't go into the pit, because if you go into the pit, you're not coming back.
Your eyes are open? Your eyes are closed?
Well, I'm conversing with the doctor, so I don't know if they're open or not. I mean, and I'm, frankly, not craning my neck to look down at the floor. So it's not like I visually saw it, but I felt it. Like suddenly there was this pit. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff. You can kind of feel you can feel the void, right? I was like, oh my God, I'm getting pulled into this hole, right? And it was a completely new experience. I hadn't felt it before. It was there very suddenly, and it was unopposable, right? I mean, it was just, this is what's happening. And I got very scared. And as I got scared, suddenly I, in quotation marks, saw my dead father above me. Now, not only am I an atheist, but my father was an atheist. He had died 8 years earlier. He was a physicist and a rationalist and trained me well in all those practices, basically, right? And that way of thinking about the world. And my mother, who was kind of a bit on the woo-woo side, he drove her crazy by sort of asking precise questions about her beliefs, like, what do you mean bad energy? Like, how does bad energy make you sick? He would ask things like that, which it's amazing they stayed married. But at any rate, suddenly my dead father was above me and to my left. And I was shocked to see him because I'm still talking to the doctors, right? It's not like I had cardiac arrest and I'm in some netherworld, right? I'm still there, and there he is above me in the room. And he communicated to me something along the lines of, it's okay, you don't have to fight it. You can come with me, I'll take care of you, right? And I was absolutely horrified. I mean, it was almost grotesque. I was almost offended. Like, go with you, you're dead. Why would I go with you? Like, I'm alive. We have nothing to talk about. And I love my dad, right? I said, we have nothing to talk about. I'm not going anywhere with you.
Why do you think you weren't comforted by him in some way? For example, you hadn't seen him in 8 years. It's clear from your book that you have an amazing affection for your father. It's not like this is a person you don't love or miss. I just find it interesting, and there's no answer to this question, but your aversion to his presence, does it suggest to you that something about engaging with him in any way was tantamount to death for you?
Well, he was clearly inviting me to join him where he was, and I knew he was dead, right? And I wasn't literally thinking in my mind, I have 2 little girls, I'm married, I have a lot to live for, I'm only 58 for God's sake. I wasn't thinking those thoughts precisely, but there was this basic dichotomy. There's the black pit, there's my dead father, and that's all death. That's nothingness, right? You're outbound on a journey you're not coming back from into the nothing, right? That's what it felt like. And he was part of that. And I was almost offended that he would imagine that I would prefer to go with him into that than to stay in my life, right? And I almost worried that it would hurt his feelings. I mean, it was like on that level of like, don't you want to spend time with your daddy? And I was like, no, you're dead. Like, I want to spend time here for the rest of my life. We'll talk later, and it was a very, very visceral response, and I really was horrified. And one of the theories about near-death experiences is that it's an adaptive sort of like behavior that's a form of comforting, it's comforting to the dying person that they see beloved loved ones and, I'm not just leaving this life. I'm sort of going, I'm sort of crossing over into this beautiful world of all these dead people that I miss. And, it's going to be fine. Like, that was absolutely not the case for me. I was horrified. And I said to the doctor, because he just kept fumbling around what to me felt like fumbling around with my neck, right? I know that's not fair to him, but that's what it felt like. And I said, you got to hurry. I'm going. Like, I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know I was dying, but I knew I was going somewhere where I wasn't coming back. I knew that much. And he got the line in, and they started transfusing me.
So are you realizing this for the first time in the ICU the next day, or are you just remembering it and now experiencing it sort of through your memory the second time?
In the ICU, I remembered experiencing it for the first time.
I see.
Right. Like, it was an extremely powerful memory, and it was terrifying. And, I'd just woken up from whatever they put me, put me under with, and the nurse, I was woken up by the nurse talking over me, talking to the other ICU nurse, and I was woken up by voices. I opened my eyes. She said, good morning, Mr. Junger. Congratulations, right? And as soon as she said it, I remembered that I'd had this horrifying encounter with my father and with the pit. And it was the next thing I thought. So, it wasn't like my brain was so confused. It was like I was extremely drunk or something like that. My brain was so confused in those moments. I was rational enough to speak to the doctor, but I was in a very strange state of mind. So it wasn't like in that moment, I was thinking, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I'm seeing my dead father. didn't have that kind of self-conscious awareness of the moment the way when we might now. I mean, if I saw my dead father above me right now, I'd be like, do you see that above us? Because he's right there. Like, it wasn't like that, right? But it was the first thing that came back to me when I woke up, and it was the first thing I asked my wife, because again, I'm a journalist and I'm a skeptic, and I was sort of worried that I'd somehow unconsciously cooked all this up later, right? And so I asked my wife, like, what when you came into the room, what happened? Like, what did I? And she said, the first thing you said to me was, I almost died last night, and I saw my father. It was the first thing I told her. And so whatever that means, I'm confident that I had some sort of experience in those moments, and not one that was sort of like conjured later retroactively. I can't prove that, of course, but that's my sense about it.
So say more about this nurse. What else did she tell you?
Yeah, so she she dropped that bomb on me, right, and left to go attend to the other patients, and I'm lying on the bed. I've got 6 units of blood and sloshing around in my abdomen. I got 10 people's blood inside me. I've got tubes all over the place. I'm in incredible pain. I'm throwing up blood because somehow the blood got into my digestive system as well. And I was throwing up blood that whole morning. It was really unpleasant. And I'm trying to digest this news that I almost died. It just seemed inconceivable. It would be as inconceivable as when you wake up in the morning, tomorrow morning when you wake up, instead of waking up in your bed at home with your wife, you wake up in a hospital, and the first thing you hear is, honey, you almost died last night. Right? Like that. It was that inconceivable. Like, what?
Even though you remember the events of the day that led you there.
Yeah, but
that didn't ease the...
I didn't know I didn't know anything about what dying feels like. And I pictured it to feel way more catastrophic than what I experienced. Right? I was in compensatory shock the whole drive down there. And then I was in a very, very weird state and in a lot of pain. And it just was inconceivable to me that this was it, right? Like, this is the big deal. This is dying. This is like, it just seemed like there'd be more blood on the floor. There'd be something, right? I mean, I had belly pain. Like, it just didn't.
But it didn't resonate to you yet that if there are 10 pieces of Swiss cheese that were placed on top of each other, you happen to be one of those 10 stacks where a pencil still made it through.
Right.
Did that occur to you yet? Because there's so much freakish luck, right? We could recount it all, but we don't need to, right? At this point, there were 10 things, all of which had to happen for you to survive, right up into including having the right interventional radiologist there. Did that resonate yet, or was it
not till later? And when I figured that out, when I found that out, as I started to do the research, every time I encountered another facet of how unlikely it was, I would get incredibly depressed, and it still depresses me. Like, when I talked to the mentor of the guy who saved my life, and he said, Dr. Dombrowski is one of maybe in the 5% of all IR guys who could have saved your life. I felt my spirits just plummet, right? And there wasn't any of this sort of like former athlete in me of like, yeah, I did something almost no one else can do. There wasn't any pride in there, right? It was. I
wonder if
really
there's a different. Is there a sense of I don't know what the right word is. It's not gratitude. That's a bit glib. Is there a sense of awe in that? Or is there a sense of, do you believe there's meaning in that? Or do you believe that there's no meaning in that? And that it's just as fortunate, it's just as much luck as the world is full of bad luck, right? If I think of all the, I'm much more familiar, as I'm sure you and many people listening are, we're much more familiar with the opposite, right? It's like, the person who did everything right and they just happened to get hit by some drunk idiot who ran a red light and there was, virtually nothing they could have done to have prevented it. It's purely a lightning strike. And how often does bad luck take a life just as remarkable luck saved a life? Do you process it like that at all?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we all are sort of looking for meaning in the universe, and nothing, there are no coincidences, and everything happens for a reason, and all those sort of like narratives that we put on I think a fairly random universe, and I mean random, but for the laws of physics. But in terms of the events of our life, like so, I was at an American outpost in Afghanistan, and I was shocked to feel some sand flick into the side of my face. Bullets travel faster than sound, right? And the outpost would get attacked from about 500 meters out, which is quite a long shot for an AK-47 or a PKM. And by the time those bullets arrive, the bullets arrive way before the sound does, right? So some sand flicked into the side of my face. I just had time to think, what was that? I was standing against some sandbags. What was that? And then I heard da 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 da, and so that was the first burst of an hour-long firefight, and the bullets had to have hit with maybe an inch or two from my forehead, right? In my opinion, utterly random, right? I was blown up by an IED. It went off under the engine block instead of under us. The guy with the Taliban guy with the clacker in the ravine missed it by a second, right? But the whole rest of my life unfolded because of that is contained in that second, right, in some ways, and because we were spared. And so at one point I was at a reading early on, right when the book came out, and a guy raised his hand at the end. He was quite agitated, and he said, I'm Christian, and you're alive because of God's grace, and you have to come to Jesus and understand that it was only God's grace that saved you. And I said to him, one of my best friends, my brother, my colleague, Tim Hetherington, was killed in combat in Libya on an assignment I was supposed to be on. His death was what got me out of war reporting, and then had a family, et cetera. And, he bled out also, right? I mean, from a wound in his groin, but he was in a war zone and they couldn't save him. And so I said to the guy, I said, my problem with that way of thinking, that there's some purpose here, some meaning here, is why me? Right? Like, why me and not Tim? For that matter, why me and not some 9-year-old with cancer? I'm sorry. Like, and if God is running a random lottery for his grace, I don't want any part of it, right? I think that the universe is run in, it unfolds in random ways. And I just got super, super lucky. But the fact that I got that lucky makes me profoundly grateful, and is also incredibly depressing to me. And for reasons that I can't quite understand, but I just sort of think about what was statistically supposed to happen by a factor of maybe 10 to 1 or something, or more. Probably more, right? And
have you spoken with others? I'm just very curious about that, Sebastian. The gratitude makes a lot of sense to me, and I don't know how I would feel in your situation. So this is curiosity and not certainly not judgment. I'm curious though if you've spoken with others who have survived, similar experiences. I think of my friend Rick Elias. I should introduce you guys. So Rick was on that U.S. Airways flight that had to emergency land in the Hudson. Right. So again, you've got this guy, Captain Sullenberger, who, he's the one out of
the Dombrowski
50,
of
right. That's exactly right. He's the one out of 50 guys that could have actually make the right decision with enough time to spare and then carried it out. And again, he wasn't supposed to live, right? And I've never asked him this question, but I'm, this would be an interesting topic, is how many other people on this planet who are alive only because of monumental luck. What is the balance between the gratitude and the heaviness of that tips into sort of dysthymia?
if I didn't have children, I think it would be psychologically a little easier. But what it would have left them with was such a legacy of pain and absence, and my poor wife, that made it sort of harder. And so the things that would have consoled me, like holding my daughter, like I survived, and here I'm holding my daughter in my lap, and I immediately think, oh, but this wasn't supposed to happen, right? She's supposed to be grieving me right now. By odds of 100 to 1, she should, and it's a miracle. And then I would just spin out into what could have happened. And I eventually talked to her shrink, right? I mean, my wife was like, honey, you're getting a little hard to live with. Like, can you seek help? And it was a great thing to do. And it really, really helped me. And my therapist was basically, she was like, listen, if you keep telling yourself this narrative that you almost died, you're never going to escape this incredible anxiety and panic disorder and depression that you've worked yourself into. You have to stop telling yourself this story. She was absolutely right. And apparently this sort of negative storytelling is very, very common in people who almost died. Like, the sequence of really, really profound anxiety and fear, medical paranoia. It's going to happen again. Any moment I'm going to bleed out again, like that sort of paranoia. And then that finally eased off, and I wound up in this like unbelievable depression. And I've never been depressed in my life, right? And I'm not a particularly anxious person. And I was amazed at how debilitating depression was. And I finally got it because I've had friends who have struggled with depression. I lost a friend to suicide, and suddenly I was like, oh, this is what they're talking about. Like, why bother going through the rest of your life? Like that kind of thought. Like, I had no idea. Like, it really opened a door into like, oh, I had no idea. That's when people say depression, this is what they're talking about. And it was quite frightening. One of the problems, so I had trouble. I know we have to get back to the nurse, which is part of this problem, right? This reality problem that I had. I was having trouble understanding, being confident about what reality was and what it wasn't. And part of that stemmed from this somewhat clairvoyant dream that I had. So I just have to reiterate, I'm really not a spiritual, mystical, or woo-woo person. I'm really not, right? Which is why this stuff unsettled me so much, right?
Much more your father than your mother.
Much more, right? Which is why this is unsettling to me, right? And so 36 hours prior, the only symptoms I had that something was awry in my abdomen was sort of intermittent pain that would come and go. And, if I were more responsible, I would have gone to the doctor and they would have scanned me and they would have seen a big ass aneurysm in my pancreatic artery. They would have fixed it without all the drama, right? But I didn't do that, and it wasn't consistent enough to like get me to the doctor. And I just thought anything that's going to kill me is going to be agonizing. I just thought, in a stupid way, I was like, it's not going to. If I can bear the pain, it's not going to. Well, what could it do, right? So, I thought I had irritable bowel syndrome as I sort of like cooked up for some internet Googling, right? And what it probably was the aneurysm starting to dissect a little bit and leak a little bit of blood into my abdomen. And that's the pain I was feeling. And my body on some level, I think, knew like there's a 5-alarm fire coming, right? And so 36 hours prior to nearly dying, I was woken up at dawn. So my family, we co-sleep and on a big pad on the floor. And I was woken up at dawn by this horrific nightmare, a nightmare that of the sort I've never had, I've never even heard of. And in the nightmare, I was already dead. It started with me already dead. I'm a ghost. I'm a spirit. And I don't know that I'm dead. And my family is below me, and they're grieving, and I realize they're grieving me, and and I don't know I'm dead, right? So I'm like waving my arms and shouting, "Hey, I'm over here! I'm right here! I'm right here!" And they can't hear me, and they can't see me, and then I'm made to understand that it's too late. That because of my own stupidity, I didn't take my life seriously, and I assume this to mean the intermittent pain in my abdomen, because I didn't take things seriously. I was cavalier about life, like capital L life. I was cavalier about life, and now it's too late. There's no going back. You're dead, and you're outbound, and you're not coming back. And I was so frantic with terror and anguish and shame incredible sense of
In
shame.
the dream or when you woke up?
In the dream.
Okay.
Just that I had somehow squandered this great treasure of life. I just hadn't taken something seriously, and now there's no going back. There's no retrieving it. And it woke me up, and suddenly I'm in my bed. I'm like, oh, thank God I'm not dead, because it had felt so real. I sort of clutched my little girl, right? I woke up next to my eldest daughter, and I clutched her like I've seen her clutch her stuffies, right? Just like, oh, thank God you're here, like that I'm here. I mean, I was just overwhelmed with gratitude and fear.
But were you in pain when you woke up? Was the abdominal pain present?
No, it wasn't. It was just a dream. The pain was very, very rare and intermittent, but sort of unmistakable.
How long had it been going on?
About 6 months.
Did the dream, because you had a full day after that dream before the day where this all happened.
That's right.
In that one lucid day, did it cross your mind? That dream really,
I talked to my wife about it. And, I'm an older dad. I had my first child at 55, and I sort of ascribed it to just sort of mortality anxiety about being an older dad. How long am I going to live into their lives, into their hopefully adult lives? I didn't really think about it. And lots of compartments in my head, I put things places where I can't reach them. Dealing with fear and other things as a journalist, you need those compartments and you can't function. And I got extremely good at sort of like having these sort of like firewalls that separate me from emotions that like are problematic and get in the way of what I'm trying to do. And to some degree it's adaptive and helpful in our lives, and after a certain point it's maladaptive. And I clearly I'd got to that point, right? But I didn't know it. And so after coming back from the hospital, and I will get back to the nurse because she's crucial here, but after coming back from the hospital, I was in the ICU for 5 days. I recovered very, very quickly. And in the general floor population for a couple of days, and then they discharged me. I was out of there, right? And I got home, and I started researching NDEs, near-death experiences, because I was really confused about seeing my father in the black pit and the rest of it. And so it turns out that I had a rather classic NDE, and the NDE experiences, they're not sort of infinite in variety, right? Like there's an infinite number of hallucinations you might have on LSD, but the NDEs, they fall into sort of like half a dozen basic sort of buckets, right? A black pit, a tunnel with a light at the end of it, dead relatives showing up, hovering over your body. There's like half a dozen sort of basic scenarios.
And what's interesting about this, sorry to interrupt, Sebastian, because again, I think it's really fascinating. This is technology and culture agnostic.
Yeah.
In other words, these stories that you've researched, and others have as well, it doesn't seem to matter when. Like as far back as we have record,
right,
it's the same thing. So it's not like, well, we're influenced. This is just a result of the TV shows we watch.
Right.
And again, it's culturally agnostic, which is also...
It's odd, right? It's not like Christians have certain, whatever, like the slight variations between cultures, but not enough to ascribe it to culture, right? It seems like a more universal experience.
Yeah.
And so I'm researching this stuff, and one of the classic NDE experiences is hovering over your family or over the sort of surgery bay where the doctors are losing you, right? And unable to communicate, and you're sort of above them, and you're getting tugged between this force that's pulling you outwards into the beyond, and these last ties to your earthly coil. And so, I had no interest in NDEs at all. I didn't know anything about them. I just, so I had these experiences with a rather clean slate, right? I'm not culturally prepped for these experiences, right? And so I realized I had rather classic NDEs, both in the moment and also in this weird dream. And this was the fear that I was seized with. And this is how paranoid and anxious I was. I thought, oh my God, obviously I died in my sleep. That was my dream, was my experience of actually dying. And my wife woke up to her dead husband in the bed. And I don't know it because I continued on under the illusion that I went to the hospital, that I came back, that here I am holding my daughter in my lap, and it's one long dying hallucination. And I'm not really here. I'm a ghost. And I'm imagining all this. And, it's laughable, except it's not disprovable.
Exactly. I was just about to say, that's the challenge.
Right? And if you're sufficiently traumatized, and I've been traumatized in combat, and I know there's a sort of bumpy road to recovery afterwards. I know it pretty well. It sort of fades over time, like the grief when you lose a loved one and whatever. We're designed to adapt, to survive, right? Humans, we're amazing. We're resilient, right? Unless you're particularly traumatized when you're young, which makes resilience harder. So I know that terrain, right? It completely eclipsed anything from combat, right? And I was really traumatized by this because, when you're a war reporter, you're making a conscious choice to go to the poker table and bet your chips, right? All right, I'm going to go to Bosnia. I'm going to go to Ukraine. I got some chips. I think I'm a good enough poker player. I can wager my chips, come back with more chips, right? Career, whatever, experience, whatever it is, maybe I'll get a book out of it. I'm going to come back with more chips before I lose my shirt, right? I'm going to leave the poker table before I lose everything. And I'm going to come back with these sort of riches, whatever they may be, experiential riches, right? Professional riches. I stopped doing that. I was like, oh, Tim got killed. I'm going to get cleaned out the next time. I'm leaving the poker table, right? And I had a family. And so what was so traumatizing was that I thought I was safe, right? And it's like owing the mafia money, right? Like there's nowhere you can go where you won't have to pay this back. We will find you. You can go to Northern Canada. You can go to Calcutta. We are coming after our 100K. And you can't hide from us. And that basically is what the universe is doing. It's like, look, we loaned you some carbon, right, to make your body out of. We will be reclaiming that eventually, Mr. Junger, right? And I thought I could sort of delay that. And you can't. You just don't know. None of us know that this isn't the last day of our life. I woke up that morning with not a clue, right, other than this crazy dream, not a clue that this was it, a beautiful June day, right? And that's what was so incredibly disturbing. And it was what sort of warped my mind afterwards. And then I found out, and there was some consolation in this, that thinking that you're not alive is a not uncommon delusion for people who almost died. It's a sort of known thing. And likewise, the depression, the anxiety, like I was doing something that many people who have almost died, and particularly almost died for medical reasons, have gone through. So there was some sort of comfort in that. But let me finally return to this amazing nurse. So I woke up to the sound of the voice of a middle-aged woman with a heavy Boston accent, which makes sense because I was in Hyannis, Massachusetts, right? Talking about, she and the other nurse were discussing me, right? And I woke up, good morning, Mr. Junger. Congratulations. You almost died last night, right? And then they left, right, to attend to other patients. And I just sat there just thinking about this news, like I almost died last night. Are you kidding? Like, it was horrifying. And it is not the sort of woohoo party, like, wow, I almost died. Here I am. Let's celebrate. It was absolutely crushing. And I sat there physically incredibly compromised and in a lot of pain and throwing up blood and thinking about the fact that I'd almost, as they say, had almost bought the farm and not known it. And she came back like an hour later and said, how you doing? How you doing, Mr. Junger? Like the accent. And I said, well, I'm okay, but frankly, what you told me is terrifying and I can't stop thinking about it. And she said, try this. Instead of thinking about it like something scary, try thinking about it like something sacred. And then she walked out. And so then I lay there thinking about that. Now, I don't go to church. I don't believe in God. But the word sacred, I feel, is one that us secular people have every right to use. And there's very, very fine secular meanings that you can bring to it. And for me, something sacred, a sacred task is anything that allows people to live with more dignity, more love, more freedom, less fear. Like those are sacred things. And religion can be sacred because it can achieve those things. It can really elevate human dignity applied in the right ways. It can also obviously destroy it. Therapists can have it sacred, like school teachers, even journalists, right? In my mind, I'm like, okay, what do we do? On our best days, right? We go to places that are at least difficult and hard and intimidating, if not downright dangerous. And we try to come back with information that society, the human race, can make some use of to chart a better course, to maybe protect human dignity in Ukraine a little bit better, to help the human lot a little bit, right? Like that, and that is a sacred task by my own secular definition of what sacred is. And I've done this my whole life, and it's a responsibility and frankly an honor that I take extremely seriously, and I'm very proud to be able to do and feel quite sort of humble about it. Like, wow, really? Me? I get to do this? And it's a really, it's one of the things that, and being not just a father, but a good father and a good husband, it's one of the things that I am the most proud of in my life, is that I was able to do this passing well for a number of years, right? And so I thought, what about now? I stopped going to front lines, but then I went to the ultimate front line, which is my own death, my own mortality, this thing we all face and that almost all of us fear. I was allowed to go to the precipice, look over the edge, and then allowed to come back. Did I come back with any sacred knowledge? In other words, any knowledge that will help me or other people live with more dignity, less fear, more connection, more love, et cetera, et cetera. That's the task, right? That's what this nurse has asked me to do. Now, she might have meant it in a completely Christian sense. I have absolutely no idea. After I recovered and started thinking about writing a book, of course, I thought, because I interviewed everyone who I could at the hospital and elsewhere, I thought, I got to talk to this lady, this amazing woman. Like, what did she mean? I mean, I know what I know what use I made of it, but what did she mean, right? So I called the hospital, the PR, the sort of media relations office, and they weren't much help. And then I finally got a phone line into the ICU and asked the gal at the desk, like, so a middle-aged lady, Boston accent, was working on June 17th. No one by that description here. No, there's a young woman with a Boston accent, but no, she hasn't. She's been off lately, whatever. I mean, and I kept calling and trying to, and I could not find her. And when I told the story at a reading, one woman said, well, clearly she was your guardian angel. And, she appeared to help you in your moment of need. Oh, maybe. I mean, I don't know, right?
Or a traveling nurse that they forgot about or something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or in just a hospital bureaucracy, they couldn't figure out who she was, or she didn't want to talk to the press, right? She was like, no way, I'm not talking to this guy, right? He saw his dead father. I have nothing to do with this, right? Like, who knows, right? No idea. But because I had such trouble figuring out what was reality and what wasn't, of course it crossed my mind. I mean, I saw my dead father. Maybe I imagined a nurse, maybe I imagined a nurse who had exactly the information, the idea, which of course is contained somewhere in me. I just didn't have access to it, who had the information that I needed at that moment. So, who knows? And it doesn't really matter, but it was an extraordinary experience for me.
Anybody who remembers our first discussion and who's familiar with your work knows that no one's ever accused you of being disconnected, right? So it's not like prior to June 17th or June 16th, 2020, you were a guy who was distracted. You were a guy who was, numbing the pain of life with hedonic pleasures and things of that nature. You are literally the only person I know who doesn't have a smartphone, who lives, as close to off the grid as possible. And all of that permits you to have this remarkable connection with the people who matter most to you, most importantly, your family. So it's almost a little ironic that if we consider this a gift, it was given to you. You almost think that if anybody needs a gift like this, it's someone like me, right? It's a guy who's way more distracted and way more frenetic, and maybe, like most people listening, could use the realignment of what is sacred. So, given all of that, I'm really curious what has changed in you.
Right. So what I would say is, as I sort of went into my midlife, I dropped a number of things that made me feel very, very good when I was young, right? I really enjoyed alcohol, frankly. I never did any drugs, but I really enjoyed alcohol. 9 years ago, I stopped drinking. I wasn't an alcoholic, but it was playing a role in my life that I wasn't interested in continuing. And I stopped. I was a totally obsessive athlete, right? So I was a pretty good marathon runner and distance runner when I was young. I ran 4:12 for the mile, which isn't world class, but it's a decent time. I ran 2:21 for the marathon, 30 minutes for 10K, decent times requiring an obsessive amount of effort.
Those are
focus.
For people who don't run, those are exceptional times.
And the effort consumed my life, and I was running 120 miles a week at 6-minute pace, and didn't, I was clearly avoiding something. I mean, and I look back, I was clearly avoiding a certain sort of emotional experience that I didn't feel prepared for and probably wasn't mature enough for, wasn't ready for yet. And it did all that quite well. And, my father was really was quite a brilliant physicist in his specialty of acoustics. He was very, very clearly on the spectrum. Spectrum disorder runs, disorder is a bad word because it has so many adaptive uses, but spectrum tendency, definitely runs through my family, and I can see it in both directions, downstream and upstream from me. And there is a certain sort of focus of mind that, you're looking at the world through a toilet paper tube, right? Like you're seeing the small circle of light and that's all you're seeing, which means you can focus incredibly intensely on it, right? And you're pretty oblivious to everything else. And what I watched my father do, and I have a watered down version of this, is this sort of like dogged pursuit of some kind of penetrating insight, some kind of excellence, some kind of transcendent accomplishment. We get there. Right? Like I, if I may say this about myself, I write good books that affect people. Like I did it, right? Like I figured out how to do it. It requires a huge amount of concentration. My father really advanced physics in interesting ways, right? A lot of his fellow physicists are exactly the same way. Just ask their wives, like out to lunch most of the time, right? So what the cost of that is you're not experiencing your life in emotional terms. And when there are emotions in your life that are unpleasant or even terrifying to deal with, you could actively turn on this obsessive focus in order to avoid dealing with it, right? So there's a kind of passive, I don't notice. But then when a threatening emotion comes along, like a painful breakup or whatever it may be, then you can really turn on the jets, right, and really blast off into whatever direction you're doing. For a while, it was 120 miles a week. Then later in my life, it was this pursuit of journalism, this maniacal focus that I'm capable of. And once you get into that sort of rhythm of being able to go through life, you're richly rewarded for the accomplishments that come with that kind of focus. So society is around you saying, well done, sir. Awesome. Amazing. Your book changed my life. Your blah, 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 whatever it may be. You might be a musician. That comes in all flavors, right? And so you think your life is a raging success, but actually you're not experiencing the actual feeling of being alive all the time. Right. And I remember at one point, so I've been married, I'm on my second marriage. My first marriage didn't work. I'm still very good friends with my ex-wife, but the marriage didn't work. And as my first wife and I exited that marriage, any divorce is incredibly sad and painful, even if it's amicable, which ours, thank God, was. And we're both good people, and we loved each other, and we did it really quite well. But I was incredibly sad, and I was still going through this sort of the legal process of divorce, and really very, very sad, and found myself in this wonderful new relationship that turned into my second marriage and my family. So it all, it's all ended quite well for both me and my former wife. So in this process, because I'm not in touch with my feelings at all, or at least unless absolutely necessary, I would just drop into these pits, right, of sadness. And I didn't know what they were. And my wife, Barbara, the woman I'm married to, said one day, she said, honey, something seems up today. Like, are you all right? And I said, no, I'm not. I feel really strange. I don't know what it is. And she said, maybe, the divorce is, like you're going through all this stuff. Maybe you're just really sad. I was like, oh my God, you're right. That feeling, that not feeling quite right, it's sadness. Why are you so brilliant? Like, I'm sad. That's exactly what it is. I couldn't believe her insight, right? And so I said to her, not tongue in cheek, not trying to be funny, before I could catch myself, I said, in the future, if you could tell me how I'm feeling, it would be so helpful. It's like, you're a freak, right? Like, what are you talking about? And so all that to say that you're right. I'm not distracted. I'm tuned out.
Right.
I'm out there. Not as bad as my father. My father, and again, this is real physicist territory, was like really, really out there. But I'm out there enough, and there's enough sort of problematic and painful emotional territory in my life that I found quite a good refuge in athletics. And then this incredible sort of like professional endeavor that I so completely fell in love with.
Twice you've alluded to the fact that you're an atheist, and yet I think that something that is worth pointing out here is that whether a person is an atheist or a believer doesn't speak to another dimension, which is there or is there not an afterlife?
Yeah.
And those two do not require each other.
No.
In other words, there's really a 2x2 that we should be considering here, which is there a God or a creator, or is there not?
Right.
And is there an afterlife, or is there not?
Right.
And there are four squares there.
Yeah, I saw you draw 4 squares on your piece of paper, and I was like, I think I know what's coming.
Yes, and I've been thinking a lot about this, right? Because the God problem is an enormous problem, right? Because on the one hand, I don't actually understand how any of us exist. In the sense that, like, if you just think about it stochastically, it doesn't make any sense. None of this makes sense. I can't. It does. There's no amount of knowledge I have about biology, mathematics, and physics that explains why I'm sitting here and why you're sitting here and why we're doing what we're doing right now, right? The 3 billion base pairs that define you, the 3 billion base pairs that define me, each of those base pairs has 4 possible DNA molecules that could define them. Like, we don't, the numbers are so big, they don't add up. So none of this makes sense. So you can go down the path of, well, there must be a creator, but then you're stuck with the who created the creator problem. And then you wrap yourself around that axle. Okay. So let's not even interrogate that, because neither of us are equipped to, and it sounds like neither of us are particularly predisposed to believe that anyway. But if we just focus on this afterlife question, which again doesn't require a God necessarily, it's hard to do it without talking about physics, right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's hard to talk about anything without talking about physics. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what the world is. That's what reality is made up out of: is particles and atoms and the laws of physics that govern them. So yes, I agree.
Now, one of the things you wrote about in your book that I couldn't believe was your relationship to one of the greatest physicists of the last 100+ years, which is Erwin Schrödinger.
Yeah.
You want to recount the story of how you find yourself within his sphere?
Yeah, so my father grew up in Europe. He was born in Dresden. His father was Jewish. His mother was Austrian Italian, Catholic, and which was an unheard of pairing back in the 19 teens, 1920s.
Your father's born right after World War I.
Yeah, he was born in 1923 in Dresden. 10 years later, the Reichstag fire. Germany people know where this is headed. And they decamp for Spain. My dad's dad was Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jewish, so he spoke Spanish and Russian and German. And so they went to Spain, and 3 years there. My dad's 13 when the fascists come in under Franco. And so now my father's fluent German and fluent Spanish. They leave Spain for France, and he goes to French high school, and then when he is 17, I think, the Germans come into France. So now they flee France, wind up in Portugal, picks up Portuguese along the way, and then lands in America and learns English. So as I am fond of saying, thanks to the fascists, my father spoke 5 languages fluently, right? 5 European languages fluently. So that's how he came to America. But his mother's side of his family was from Austria, from Salzburg. They're upper middle class. And my father's mother was born in 1900 and was this great beauty. It was known as a great beauty in the small city of Salzburg, as were the twins, Attia and Viti Junger. And they were sort of renowned as teenage girls for being really beautiful. And the family happened to know the Schrödingers. Schrödinger, this preeminent physicist, Schrödinger's cat, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, etc. And Nobel Prize. And so Schrödinger was in his 40s and had a family and was a bit of a dog, right? I mean, affairs all over the place, and as many people had then and still do, I suppose. And so at one point, these girls, the twins, they're failing math. They're failing high school math, right? They're 16. They're failing high school math. And the mother has the great idea of calling Schrödinger's wife, saying, I know your husband's a mathematician. My girls are failing math. Do you think they could come visit for the summer in Germany where the Schrödingers were living? Could come visit for the summer, and maybe he can sort of tutor them in math. I mean, you just have to understand how completely ridiculous. Now, I mean, it's like Einstein, right? It's like they're failing, like sophomore math. Like, can Erwin help them? So off the girls go for a summer in Germany, and Schrödinger falls in love with Attia, one of the twins, and he manages to get them through their math tests, right? That but the math is so simple that he actually doesn't understand it very well because it's so simple. So he has to consult with his wife's lover, who's a mathematician, not a physicist, right? And so there's this whole, there's just the sort of romantic drama of these people is just extraordinary. And anyway, thank God the girls passed their exams, and Attia and Schrödinger, they tastefully wait until she's 18 and he's 45 or something. And they have this passionate affair that lasts some years. Tragically, she got pregnant. The pregnancy was aborted, and as a result, she was never able to have children. And, I knew her much later in her life when I was a child. And she was married and, a rather sad figure, frankly. Probably due to, what was really a tragedy in a young woman's life of losing the ability to have children. But he was really in love with her. And so that's Schrödinger and the family. I have letters that he wrote. I have letters and poems that he wrote her, right, handwritten, In fact, there's a biography of Schrodinger, a wonderful biography that came out in the 80s or 90s. And in the bookmark where my father had, like marked something, the bookmark is a handwritten letter by Schrodinger to E.T. Like that's the bookmark in the biography that I found on the shelf. So that's our history with Schrodinger.
So we talk about his cat. Many people probably know the experiment, but it's a thought experiment, a Gedanken experiment that's worth maybe explaining because it really speaks to the challenge of, at least one of the challenges of understanding quantum mechanics. Do you want to just briefly sort of explain this thought experiment and what purpose it serves in understanding this?
Yeah, so one of the central enigma and mystery of quantum physics is the fact that if you don't observe what a subatomic particle is doing, and I'm speaking as a civilian who read and tried to understand physics, so I'm doing my best to render it sort of like understandable, but I'm not a physicist. So the mystery is when you do not observe and try to measure the momentum and position of a subatomic particle, that it appears to be in all possible places. It's a waveform. And if you fire, say, a photon at a steel plate with two slits in it, the photon, unobserved, the photon will go through both slits and leave a signature on the strike plate on the other side that shows it simultaneously went through both slits. We can't do that. We cannot walk through two doorways at the same time. In the macroscopic world, you're in one place or the other. But unobserved, a subatomic particle appears to be able to go through two slits at the same time. It's basically a huge potentiality that only collapses into one single thing. It only goes through one slit if you actually observe it, right? And measure it. And so unavoidably, the thought arose to these early physicists, Heisenberg and Schrodinger and a number of others, most of whom were from the German-speaking world for some reason, and Dirac of course from England. Unavoidably the thought arose: is our conscious observation of subatomic reality creating the thing that we observe? And if so, is our observation of the entire universe creating the universe as observed, right? What exactly is happening? And are we creating what we see by seeing it? And so Schrodinger came up with a sort of thought experiment, a Gedanken experiment, which is that you have a cat. Why he picked a cat, I don't know, but he put a cat in a box with what he called, I think the translated from the German is what he called a fiendish mechanism. And the fiendish mechanism is an isotope that has exactly a 50-50 chance of decaying in the next hour. I'm trying to now I'm a little rough on the details.
Yeah, and there's
if
it decays in a certain way, it will emit enough radiation to kill the cat, and if it doesn't, the cat is fine. So basically, it's just that there's a 50-50 chance that this decaying isotope will kill the cat or not kill the cat.
I think actually what it is that the radiation triggers the release of a gas that instantly kills the cat.
Okay.
So there's another step. Doesn't matter. The idea is
that's
exactly 50-50, right? And the cat's in this enclosed box. And after an hour, one thing or the other, there's 100% chance that one thing or the other happened. There's no third possibility, right? Where the cat's like a little sick, right? It's one or the other. It's a complete binary. And likewise at the subatomic level, particles are in one place or another. It's a complete binary. There isn't, like in the macroscopic world, a pendulum sort of swings and traverses through all the different spaces. At the quantum level, you're in one place or another. Likewise, the cat is alive or dead. It's a massive waveform. And Schrodinger said the cat is, in quantum terms, both alive and dead simultaneously until you open the box and observe either a dead cat or a living cat. That's Schrodinger's cat.
And again, there's a great description in the book of an experiment that I actually wasn't aware of. This experiment that took place, I believe it was off the coast of Spain in the Canary Islands, correct? Yeah. The experiment is very complicated, but it actually illustrates this point a little more, with a little more nuance. Yeah. Because, of course, a lay person listening to this is thinking, what the hell are you two idiots talking about? Like, this is a dumb story, right? But the point is, when you look at the path of these electrons or particles unobserved, they are indeed behaving this way. And this experiment, I don't know if you want to go into the experiment.
I'll try.
Yeah, it's so mind-boggling.
Yeah. Give me a flashlight. We can go into the cave, right? So it's called delayed choice quantum erasure. And I include the technical description of the experiment in the book because for the civilian, it is just like absolute madness. I mean, the words make no sense. And it's describing the physical setup of the experiment with lasers and mirrors and telephone cable and fiber optics cable. And, and it just as an example of like, this is how far out there these scientists are getting, that we don't even understand the language that they use to describe how they understand the universe. So there are things called entangled particles, and entangled particles are subatomic particles that affect each other instantaneously and have to do the same or corresponding things. And they do that. If you do something to one particle that's entangled with another particle, the entangled particle reacts in the same or complementary way instantly. And instantly means faster than the speed of light. And information cannot travel faster than the speed of light. It can't travel 1 foot faster than the speed of light, and it can't travel 50 billion light years faster than the speed of light. And what they found is that entangled particles, even on opposite sides of the universe, if you do something to one, the other entangled particle is affected instantaneously. Okay? Those are entangled particles. That's how the universe works for some reason. So they figured out a fiendish mechanism for sort of tricking the universe. And what they do is they take entangled particles, and I have no idea how they do this. You'd have to go to the original literature, and you probably won't understand it because I sure didn't. But take it on faith from the physicists. You take entangled particles, and you fire one at a double slit in the classic double slit experiment, unobserved, and we know for sure that it goes through both slits at the same time because it's unobserved. We know that that's how it works. And then with a tiny delay, you send its entangled twin through double slits and you observe it, and it's forced, because of observation, it's forced to go through one slit. But now the universe has a problem, because entangled particles have to do the same thing, and we know that they've just done different things.
And again, just so people are following us, the reason the entangled particle has to pick a slit is because it's being observed.
Right.
It's now in the quote-unquote physical world again. It's no longer a probability distribution.
Right.
It's going to behave like things that are observed behave.
Right. Pick a doorway, one or the other, but not both, right? Meanwhile, its twin that was fired off an instant before was unobserved, and so it remains, as you say, a probability distribution and physically goes through both slits at the same time and hits the strike plate on the other side with a classic waveform signature that physicists well know means it passed through both slits. So when they observe the second entangled particle going through one slit, as it has to because it's being observed, and then they look at the results of the first particle that was unobserved and had to go through both slits, when they look at the strike plate, it shows a signature of having only gone through one slit, because entangled particles have to do the same thing. But what this means is that quantum, not only do they infect each other instantaneously, but effectively speaking, the mechanism reached back in time and changed the outcome of the first entangled particle. It's delayed choice quantum erasure. And what I say in the book is that if there is any, I prefer the phrase post-death existence for the individual rather than afterlife, which just is too imbued with a kind of hopeful vision of us in a hammock with a daiquiri forever. You know what I mean? There's something a little too pleasant about that. Post-death existence for the individual. If there's anything to that, idea, I simply say in the book, it would have to work on a level of just sheer weirdness that delayed choice quantum erasure exists. Like totally unexplained. Physicists don't understand why the world.
I mean, is there a chance that there is? So if you go back to Newton, right? Like you think about Newtonian physics, which explains everything we see, right? Like we see airplanes fly. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? If you were, one of our ancestors saw that, they wouldn't understand it. But we can understand how an airplane flies. That's Newtonian physics. And of course, what happened with the quantum revolution in the early part of the 20th century is physicists realize that Newtonian physics breaks down at the atomic level, right, and you need new physics to explain what's happening there. Do physicists believe that what you're describing is to quantum theory what quantum theory was to Newtonian mechanics? In other words, is there now a third layer of physics that is as set free from what we understand today and is yet to be described potentially?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, the physicists themselves and the sort of like grandfathers of all this, like Schrödinger and Einstein, were to some degree or other, many of them were sort of unnerved by this. Like the results just didn't make sense in our sort of like
yes,
human
because
brains.
There's this other experiment, right, where Einstein basically comes to the conclusion that one of two things has to be true. Either particles are moving faster than the speed of light, or they are containing within them deciding information. Neither could be true. He sets out to prove it. And the only way he can prove it is to violate something withheld in quantum theory itself. And I believe it was through the photoelectric effect.
Yeah.
This is why, by the way, there is a fork in the road. I had to choose between mathematics and physics, and I chose math.
Right.
Like at some point I was like, I'm actually not smart enough to do quantum theory.
Yeah. And, frankly, it's I found it a little unsettling, a little scary. I mean, and I almost had this thought like, whoa, careful what we try to find out. Like, is it possible, as you approach the speed of, this is like a hopelessly sort of ignorant metaphor in some ways, but as you approach the speed of light, mass gets infinitely heavy and you can never get to the speed of light because as you approach infinitely,
mass becomes infinite.
Right, yeah. Exactly. So you can't get there. And I sort of had this thought, this sort of pedestrian thought, like as we approach complete knowledge, does the experimentation and the theories, do they get increasingly inaccurate and misleading so that we never quite get there? Because if we get there, if we have complete knowledge of everything, does that destroy everything? I mean, is there an element of consciousness can't fully understand consciousness, or it will not, if it does, it cannot sustain itself? And, that's just like thought experiment wordplay. But it did sort of make me, on a human level, just be a little queasy. Like, do we really want to interrogate God about how all this stuff works? Like, are you sure you want to know this, right? Like, are you sure you want to understand delayed choice quantum erasure?
I think there's two ways to think about this, right? The first is, would knowing this help us live better lives on this planet? The answer is probably no. But
right.
But again, you could leave that to the choice of the individual. For me personally, I think the answer is no. I think that I'm really happy as a simpleton. on the relative basis, pretty dumb. I function in form of, pleasure and love and relationships and all those things. But where it becomes really unsettling is when you contemplate life or existence or nature, matter, whatever, post-life. So that to me is the part where it's very difficult to let this go, which is, if my belief is that once I experience death as defined very clearly and very medically, there is no existence. And versus what if there might be something there, even though we can't imagine what it is, then that, I don't know, you could argue maybe knowing that does make it easier to live today. This is where I just get wrapped up and usually end up putting my head in the sand after an hour of thinking about it and just go back to watching F1 videos on YouTube.
Listen, the sand isn't a bad place. I mean, seriously, a physicist named Sir Arthur Eddington.
Yeah, the one who observed the photoelectric effect. He basically validated Einstein's prediction.
That's right. So he said about all these great mysteries, which were unsettling and perplexing all the physicists of the era, around 100 years ago, and into the 30s and 40s. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, it was something like, something we don't understand is doing we know not what. That was his ultimate evaluation of like what's going on in the universe.
I misspoke, by the way. I said photoelectric effect. It was general relativity that he observed in South Africa. In South Africa, I think, seeing the eclipse, right?
With the eclipse, exactly. And it bent the rays of light as Einstein predicted. And Einstein was great. I mean, he said, look, I mean, if you want to propose a theory, what you must offer the scientific community are the ways to disprove it.
Yeah.
Like if I'm wrong, these will be the numbers. So investigate. And if these are the numbers, I'm wrong. Yeah. I'm going to tell you how to defeat my argument, right? I'm going to tell you how to do it. And if you fail, right, then maybe my theory is right. And so that's what he did with the eclipse. And he predicted where the star would be as it passed through. I can't remember exactly what it was, whatever it was. It was the bending of light during an eclipse.
Which could only be seen because it was a complete solar eclipse.
Right. So a star that should be in one position should be in another position because of the bending of light. And in fact, if it's not in that position, I'm wrong, said Einstein. Right. So Eddington was one of the people that helped him confirm that by going to.
By the way, as a nice little tie-in to everything, do you know how Einstein died?
Yes, an abdominal aneurysm.
Yeah.
That's right. And he refused treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was like, no, he was in his 70s. Yeah. He's like, no, I'm good. Yeah. So I think that to sort of answer your question about, is this good for us or not? Other than the completely abstract and terrifying, maybe we don't want to know everything because the universe will collapse into a space-time of zero radius or whatever the phrase is. For me, it sort of allowed open. I mean, I'm still an atheist, meaning God is not part of my daily practice. It's not how I understand reality. It's not, God does not guide my decisions and my values. I'm a moral person in my own right, and I do fine with it. So God is not. So I am an atheist. I don't really particularly like the term agnostic, which I'm happy to talk about if you want.
Meaning you feel you need to either shit or get off the pot with your thinking?
Sort of. I mean, I like put it in more human terms. So if you're in a happy marriage and you have no suspicions that anything is going on that would upset you about your spouse at all, and someone said, is your wife cheating on you? And you said, well, I mean, I'm agnostic on that. I don't know. You wouldn't say that, right? I mean, unless you actually had some reason to doubt, right? So when you say I'm agnostic about God, what troubles me about that is that there's absolutely no evidence that your wife's cheating on you, right? There's absolutely no evidence that God exists, right? So if that's the case, if there is some evidence, she said she was going to the movies and she didn't go to the movies, now I could say I'm agnostic, right? But until then, until I've seen some evidence that God exists, if I saw a little bit of evidence that God exists, if I saw overwhelming proof, I would be a believer. If I saw some evidence that God exists, I would be agnostic. I'd like, well, I'm on the jury and I don't know.
Okay, so you're not opposed to the term agnostic. You're just saying you're not.
I think it's inaccurate for the way most people know it. I think
Do you think most people are in one camp or the other, and they're just not willing to admit?
Right. And I think it's like the sort of like cheating spouse analogy. Like, unless you have some reason to doubt your spouse, you say, no, she's not cheating on me. I have no reason to think that, right? No, I don't believe in God. I have no reason to think there is a God. I've never seen evidence to the effect that there's a God, right? And if there was a little bit of evidence, I'd be like hung jury. Like, there could be, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Maybe she's cheating on me, maybe she's not. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't a God. That's truly agnostic. I just don't know what would be the basis for that ambiguity.
Well, I think the challenge with the terminology is maybe that we don't have a clear definition of God, and that, for example, many different religions will have many different versions of what a God is. And then there are probably some people who wouldn't subscribe to anything within an organized religion, but would describe themselves still as spiritual and might still argue that there is a God, but not, you know, the God kind of thing. So it gets so complicated. Yeah. But again, that's why I wanted to separate it away from that, because again, there is a really clear situation of none of that matters, and we're still wrestling with the question at hand, which is, what does it mean to die on this planet? What does it mean to die in this physical body that stops respiring, to which, you know, we are rushing towards entropy?
Right. And so for me, without the help or baggage of God, however you want to think about it, I was faced after this near-death experience with some very, very puzzling, very, very puzzling memories, and specifically seeing my dead father in some form above me. And is it just neurochemistry? Yeah, possibly, right? Is there, and again, it would have to be at some quantum level, some post-death existence that we just don't understand. For the first time in my life, I would honestly say, yeah, possibly, right? I'm agnostic on it. And agnostic for specific reasons. I actually have evidence, right? There's evidence on both sides. You know, like the jury, it's a hung jury. I don't know. I don't know beyond a reasonable doubt. But the idea has been opened to me that, you know, that the suspect is possibly innocent, right? Or for the court analogy, like maybe there is something, right? And so my book is divided into two sections: what and if. What happened to me? And what if there were some post-death existence, just theoretically, as a thought experiment? How would it work? There's almost certainly not, I say in the book, there's almost certainly not, but if there were, how would it work? And that's where I sort of wound up in quantum physics. I had a hilarious conversation with some colleagues of my father, who I sort of tracked down after my near-death experience, guys who were very fond of my father. And sort of half a generation younger than him, half a generation older than me. Really, really sweet guys. And we had lunch, and I said, guys, this is what happened to me. My dead father appeared above me. And, you know, Miguel, like, what do you think he would think of this? And, you know, the conversation went on. I mean, first of all, just so you understand how unclear many physicists are with the idea of like what something romantic is. My Rudolfo said to me, well, your father was a hopeless romantic. I was like, really? Like, my mother, that would be news for my mother, right? I mean, they eloped to San Francisco to get married, and he timed it to coincide with the weekend of the annual meeting of the American Acoustical Society in San Francisco, right? So I was like, really? What makes you say that? And there's something called a Helmholtz resonator in acoustics, right? And so Rudolph said, well, he was deeply in love with the Helmholtz resonator and talked about it constantly. Like, oh, got it. Okay. All right. Yes. Hopeless romantic. So, and at one point, right after my parents were married, and then these are the brains that come up with this kind of thing, right? Right after my parents were married, she was cooking dinner and he was in an armchair, this sort of late 1950s marital idyll, right? Like he's in the armchair in front of the fire reading, she's cooking dinner, and he's muttering to himself, oh my God, that is so beautiful. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. That's just absolutely gorgeous. And of course, she's like, what has gotten my new husband's attention in this way? Like, what exactly is he looking at, right? So she tiptoes over, I think probably fearing the worst. And he has a book open, and both pages are covered with numbers and equations and symbols, right? That's what's so beautiful to him. Like, that was his brain, right? So these are the gentlemen, it's his ilk that I have lunch with, and his former colleagues. And I said, okay, guys, what are the odds? And I thought it was a rhetorical question, right? Because I'm not a physicist, so I assume this is a rhetorical question. I was like, really, what are the odds that my dead father could appear above me in some form, like while I'm dying? Like, what are the odds, right? And to my amazement, Rudolph, the Helmholtz resonator guy, looks up, and he strokes his chin, and he's sort of like running the numbers, right? I was like, oh my God, is he actually calculating this? Like, is that something you can calculate? And he said, yeah, it's around, and I'm going from memory from my book. He said, I think 10 to the minus 60, something like that. So one chance in a number that has 60 zeros after it, right? I was like, what? There's a number for this? Like, what are you talking about? He said, well, it's roughly the chance that all of the oxygen molecules in the air of this room would just randomly, through sort of through statistical mechanics, would just randomly collect in one corner of the room and asphyxiate us. Almost impossible, but it's theoretically possible, right? Well, likewise, it's probably the odds of your father rematerializing above you are roughly on that order of unlikely, right? I was like, oh my God, that's what we're dealing with. But then it turns out, if you look at the odds of the universe existing, it's way, way more unlikely. It's 10 to the minus 230. So one chance in a number that has 230 zeros after it, right? So it's the chance of finding one grain of sand. It's millions and millions of times less likely than finding one specific grain of sand in all the sand on the earth on the first try, right? Something like 30 parameters have to be in very precise places for a physical universe to exist. The force of gravity, all these sort of arcane things that most humans don't know about, and then for conscious life to develop, it's almost infinitely unlikely. And it's actually way more unlikely, at least according to Rudolph, it's way more unlikely that the universe exists in the first place, and we know that it does because we're here, than my father appearing above me. That's actually in the realm of chance, like way more likely than the universe existing in the first place, which we know it does, right? So in my book, one of the things I say is like, look, my dead father, that's once you get past the stunt of the universe going from absolutely nothing to hundreds of millions of light years across in an amount of time that's too small to measure. Once you've pulled off that party trick, the dead appearing above us in some quantum form while we're, passing through into their realm, like, yeah, I can see that we don't understand it, but I can imagine that it's possible.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's unfortunately where I find myself, Sebastian, is because I at least have enough facility with numbers. When I go through the exercise, everything you just did, coupled with even simpler things, like just the existence of us, like let's just limit it to organic material. And I can't, then I just have to accept the flaws in my own cerebral machinery, right? Which is, I'm not smart enough to understand this stuff. Like I'm not, and I never will be. Like, I don't understand consciousness. Yeah. I can't explain consciousness. I cannot. And I look at my dog and I think, well, he's conscious. Like there is a feeling of being a dog. Yeah. Like he knows what it's like to exist. And then I look at a little roly-poly and I think he's probably not conscious.
Right.
Like there probably isn't being a roly-poly the way there's being a dog or being me. But outside of those really, really broad corner edge cases, Like, I can't explain it. Like,
Yeah.
not at all. It doesn't matter how much I read.
Right. I mean, it's possible that we understand reality as well as a dog understands a television screen. Right. Like just no concept of the wider mechanics, the wider reality, the wider context that produces the flickering images that the dog sees on the screen that we see in reality. And there's a much vaster colossus around that produces what we see. And we just don't have the equipment to understand it. Schrodinger's opinion was that there was a universal consciousness, and it was a sort of vaguely Buddhist idea. And he felt that we as individuals are part of that universal consciousness and sort of reunited with it when we die. And, his theory wasn't very articulated, but that was his sort of general belief, and as was my father's. And there's a theory called biocentrism, which is unprovable and undisprovable, which basically holds that if it's true that conscious observation creates the reality that it observes, then the entire universe might have collapsed into its specific form from one enormous possibility, one enormous spectrum of possibility with the arrival of conscious thought. And that creates the universe that we're in this sort of like snake eating its own tail way. And that consciousness is part of the physical makeup of the universe at the quantum level, the way gravity is. In ways that I don't quite understand, there's something called the Higgs boson, which is it is what manifests gravity in matter. And that there might be something akin to that is connected to consciousness, which gives rise to the physical universe that in turn allows for consciousness. It's hopelessly circular.
And the Higgs boson has been observed,
Yes.
relatively recently.
That's
this
right.
is in the last decade, maybe the last 15 years.
Yep, that's right.
It's been the first observation of this.
Right. So this force that's throughout the universe, that is one of the basic reasons the universe can exist. It is there because there's a subatomic particle called the Higgs boson. No, maybe there's an equivalent for consciousness. I mean, this is all theorizing, and biocentrism sort of focuses on that. And that if that's true, then our individual consciousness, mine, yours, all of ours, is actually part of this sort of colossus of matter and consciousness, which is the universe. Not provable, not disprovable, but there is on the sort of human level, which is important not to leave behind, for me, something close to a comforting thought in that, I mean, the idea of being conscious like we are now for eternity, like you die and then the real thing starts that lasts forever and there's no exit. You can't kill yourself to get out of this deal, right? You are going to be conscious with whatever that experience is, and it may be horrific, for eternity. Thank you, no. Like, I'll take my long nap. Thank you. I don't need that, right? So an eternal afterlife isn't frankly that appealing, but the annihilation of death is also quite terrifying. And the idea that there's some sort of ill-defined consciousness that we return to and can manifest itself at these sort of threshold moments of life and death where the dead are maybe in some way sort of, quote, there with us. Like that to me is this sort of sweet spot and just comforting enough to allow us to face death, but without this sort of like, in my opinion, implausible fantasy that we're in a hammock with a daiquiri for eternity, basically. Like this sort of, oh, how lovely, the afterlife. It's just one big long vacation. Like that sounds hellish also. And so if you think about it like this, if we knew for sure, if we could prove, right, if there was actual proof and evidence that there was an afterlife, like somehow we proved it and it went on forever, that you're alive for these troubled 70, 80 years, and then whatever happened, your afterlife starts and you're just cruising for eternity. It strips all of the meaning, all the dignity, all the struggle, all of the victory out of those 70 years of struggle and joy and pain and sorrow and everything else. It's like, don't worry about it. It's just 70 years in an eternity. Like, don't worry about it. right? The eternity is going to start soon enough. There's an afterlife. It really strips from us the value of the one thing we do know exists, which is our own experience right now in this moment, this continuity of moments, right? That would be a pity to have that stripped away from us. As hard as we work in this place, like really, like don't do that. This is all we know we get. So, and, but on the other hand, if we could prove that there was no afterlife, we're completely biological beings, right? God or no God, you could have a creator God. There's like, you know what? We're going to have kangaroos and turtles and worms and humans and everything else, but they're biological. When they die, that's it. There's no afterlife. There's no soul. There's no nothing. You're dead, right?
Yeah, it's just carbon transfer.
Right. Exactly. So with or without a God, if there was a God that decided that, totally plausible. If we could prove that, you would know absolutely that when you die, you are over, right? It's as if, and not only that, it's as if you never happened. It's zero. It's nothing, right? The infinite black pit. That might be so psychologically troubling that we actually have trouble leading those 70 years, living those 70 years with dignity, right? And so in this, where we're at is this ambiguity. No, we can't prove there is or isn't an afterlife. There might be. There's some reason to hope, so we don't have to be too scared. But there's also some reason to think there might not be. So make the most of today, because that's all we know we'll get. Like this sweet spot of ambiguity is actually perfectly attuned to making this life both psychologically survivable and meaningful, right? So that's, to me, that is like another of to borrow a Christian word, another of the sort of miracles of all this. Like, wow, you really landed it, God. Like, if you're out there, you really landed us in just the right spot to absolutely maximize the meaningfulness of this thing we do have, which is life.
Yeah, you wrote it. You wrote something so beautiful near the end of the book. Without death, life does not require focus or courage or choice. Without death, life is just an extraordinary stunt that won't stop.
Right, which is a terrifying idea in its own right. And anything that won't stop is a terrifying idea, basically. So after I finished the book, I read this extraordinary story about Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer. And had I read it when I was doing the book, I probably would have put it in there. But it gives me a chance to tell a nice story during conversations like this. So when he was in his 20s, he was a bit of a political radical, and he had a bunch of radical friends, and they would sit around. They had like a circle, like an intellectual circle. And they would sit around and they talk about stuff. And they talk about, for example, freeing the serfs, right? Outrageous ideas like that, right? It's in the 1840s. And, of course, basically the same conversation was happening in the United States about the slaves, about slavery. So the Tsar Nicholas I, I think it was not particularly pleased by this talk. And his police rounded these boys up and threw them in jail. And they spent 8 years in jail. 8 months in jail. And it wasn't a particularly serious crime, right? So they were getting their wrists slapped, but no one was particularly worried about anything. And then finally, after 8 months, they were shown to the door of the prison and loaded onto a carriage. And, they just assumed they were going to be driven to the court and discharged and released to their families, and the nightmare's over. And so they're bouncing along through the streets. And instead of going to the court, they're driven to a city square and they're tied to posts. And a firing squad is lined up in front of them. They've had to make the transition psychologically from going home to my family to, I'm going to die in a few minutes, right? They had to make that transition almost instantaneously, right? So they're tied to posts, and the order is given for the soldiers to charge their weapons and level them and aim. And Dostoevsky and his buddies are waiting for the command, fire, when their chests will be torn open by musket balls. And so what happened was, this was theater. It was sadistic, cruel theater. It was a mock execution just to scare them. And a rider galloped into the square just in time and said, the Tsar forgives them. And they were untied and sent to a penal colony in Siberia for a while. But they survived. 2 of the men who went through this, of the 6 men or so who went through this, were insane for the rest of their lives. They could not take, that's what I was saying about the truth, like no afterlife, like I can't bear that thought. They could not, the unfiltered vision of infinity starting 30 seconds from now, right? Without any warm up, without any time to adjust. You have cancer, you're going to die in a year, nothing, just from life to death in some minutes, was so psychologically traumatizing that they were deranged for the rest of their lives. They never psychologically recovered. Dostoevsky did, and he took that experience and put it into some of his amazing work. But what we know, because of him, we know what the world, the nearly hallucinatory quality that that reality takes on when you do this transition abruptly from I'm alive, yay, to, oh my God, I'm going to be dead in a minute. Like, what does the world look like through the eyes of someone who's experiencing that, right? And this is what he said. He said he looked out and he saw sunlight glinting off the roof, the steeple of a church. And he thought to himself, in moments, I'm going to become part of this. I'll be part of the sunlight. I'm going to become part of all things. And if I somehow survive this, I will live the rest of my life turning every moment into an infinity, right? And he did survive it. And he took the wisdom of that vision, which, of course, if we just stopped, erased the sort of busy slates of our brains and just stopped and looked around, it's just the insane, surreal miracle that anything is. The New York City subway, a tree, the ocean, your foot, whatever. I mean, just look at any of it. You're like, oh my God, that exists? And I'm here to see it? Are you kidding? Like, that was what he got. And if you can't live like that, but if you can incorporate a little bit of that sort of strangeness of, if it looks strange, the strangeness of that vision allows for awe and gratitude, right? And when that vision becomes, when you become accustomed to it, right? When it becomes an everyday thing. I mean, there's a problem with marriage sometimes, right? You're just like, oh yeah, you fall in love, this person's amazing, and then you adjust, and they're just another person, and you love them or whatever. But that sort of awe that this person is with you, like, if you can keep that in your marriage, you have a good marriage. If you can keep that in your life, you have a good life. And that was the blessing that came with the curse of what Dostoevsky went through. And I've gotten a little bit of that in my life. And, frankly, it changed my life in a way that religion often changes people's lives. I'm not religious. It's changed it in an equivalent way, like a profound gratitude, not just for my life as I am living it, but the fact that I have a life at all and that any of us do.
So does that mean now the answer to the question that your wife posed for you is that indeed you would go through all of this again?
Yes, I would. As painful as it is to say. And I wonder if Dostoevsky would. I'm guessing he would. And those poor guys who never recovered, they wouldn't, but, and I had access to a really good shrink, a very loving family. Like, and frankly, it was touch and go for a while. I mean, it could have really, I still have a sort of weird panic anxiety disorder around health issues. And I'm like prone to imagining that something's catastrophically wrong with me in a kind of paranoid Woody Allen kind of way. Like, oh my God, I'm sure I've got cancer. Like, I mean, everyone does that a little bit, I think, but it really opened up the gateway for me. It's extremely unpleasant. And I know that paranoid feeling comes flooding into me, and it's a direct result of almost dying on a beautiful June day, and so it's not without its costs, but because I'm blessed to have some incredibly wonderful, beautiful things going for me in my life, like I was able to sort of pull it off.
Sebastian, thank you very much. Again, the book is really, really special. not just as a story, but if you're willing as the reader, I think to let yourself really contemplate and imagine what's being described and accept the impossibility of being able to understand it and being able to resolve it and being able to find a proof. It certainly offers more questions than answers, but that's what makes it worth living, right?
Thank you. I'm so glad that you read it and enjoyed it so much, and that you invited me on. What a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you.